The reservation stretched endlessly under the Oklahoma sky, a patchwork of red earth and stubborn grass that had witnessed centuries of both triumph and heartbreak. On this particular evening, as the sun bled orange across the horizon, Sarah Chen stood at the edge of the annual Comanche Nation Fair, her wedding dress a stark contrast of white against the dusty ground. She shouldn't have been here. She should have been at the Ritz-Carlton in downtown Oklahoma City, preparing for tomorrow's ceremony with 200 guests, a 12-tier cake, and her fiancé Marcus, whose family had planned every detail down to the color of the napkins. But life has a way of unraveling our carefully constructed plans. 3 hours earlier, Sarah had been driving to her rehearsal dinner when she witnessed an accident on Highway 62. A pickup truck had swerved off the road, and without thinking, she'd pulled over, wedding dress and all, to help. The driver, an elderly Comanche man named Joseph Tabone, had been shaken but uninjured. While waiting for the ambulance, he'd looked at her dress and asked a simple question: "What are you running toward, or what are you running from?" The question had cracked something open inside her. Before she knew it, she was telling this stranger everything: how Marcus's family had taken over her wedding, how she'd lost herself in trying to please everyone, how she couldn't remember the last time she'd made a decision that felt truly hers. Joseph had smiled, a weathered expression full of knowing. "Come with me to the fair tonight," he'd said. "There's someone you should meet. After that, if you still want that big wedding, you'll know it's right. But if you don't, well, you'll know that too." Now Sarah stood near the powwow arena, her designer dress collecting dust, watching as the giant Comanche emerged from the gathering crowd. He wasn't physically giant, perhaps 6 feet tall, but there was something about his presence that filled the space around him. His name was William Redbird, and Joseph had introduced him as the man who shows people what they're made of. William's face was a map of deep lines, his long gray hair pulled back in a traditional manner, and his eyes held a penetration that made Sarah feel simultaneously exposed and safe. He wore regalia that spoke of ceremony and tradition, intricate beadwork catching the fading light. "So you're the bride who stopped to help," William said, his voice like distant thunder. "Joseph tells me you're lost." "I'm not lost," Sarah protested. "I know exactly where I'm supposed to be tomorrow." "Knowing where you're supposed to be and knowing where you need to be are different things," William replied. He gestured toward the arena where preparations were underway for the evening's dancing. "Tonight, show me what you can do," he whispered, leaning closer. "Not what you've been taught to do, not what others expect. Show me what lives in your heart when no one is watching." Sarah felt her breath catch. "I don't understand." "You stopped for Joseph today. In that moment, you weren't a bride, a daughter, or anyone's expectation. You were purely yourself, responding to a need. That's who I want to see tonight. I'm not Comanche. I don't know your dances, your ways." "This isn't about being Comanche," William interrupted gently. "This is about being human. About finding the courage to be authentic." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "There's a tradition here. When someone stands at a crossroads, confused about their path, we give them a challenge. Not to test their strength, but to reveal what they've forgotten about themselves." Sarah looked at the arena, then down at her ridiculous, out-of-place wedding dress. Everything in her life had been so carefully orchestrated, so perfectly arranged. When had she last done something unexpected, something raw and real? "I'll surprise you," she said quietly, though she wasn't entirely sure what she meant. William's eyes crinkled with approval. "I'm counting on it, daughter. I'm counting on it." The drums began as darkness settled over the fairgrounds, their rhythm ancient and insistent, a heartbeat that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Sarah stood at the edge of the arena, her expensive wedding dress now thoroughly dusty, her carefully styled hair beginning to escape its pins. Around her, dancers in full regalia prepared to enter the circle, their movements purposeful and reverent. William appeared beside her, carrying something bundled in soft cloth. "For you," he said, unwrapping a shawl of deep blue, embroidered with butterflies in silver and gold thread. "My late wife made this. She always said butterflies understand transformation better than any creature, they don't resist it, they embrace it. I can't accept this, Sarah whispered, touching the intricate beadwork with trembling fingers. You're not accepting it, you're borrowing it. For tonight. William draped the shawl over her shoulders, and Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, as if the weight of the fabric was somehow lighter than the weight she'd been carrying. What am I supposed to do? She asked. Watch first. Listen. Then, when you're ready, let yourself move. Sarah watched as dancer after dancer entered the circle. There were jingle-dressed dancers, their regalia covered in small metal cones that created a sound like rain. There were fancy dancers, spinning and leaping with explosive energy. There were traditional dancers, moving with dignified grace that spoke of centuries of practice. Each person carried themselves with a pride and authenticity that made Sarah's chest ache with longing. She thought about her wedding preparations, how she'd spent months selecting exactly the right shade of ivory for the tablecloths, how she'd tasted 17 different cake flavors, how she'd said yes to Marcus's mother's suggestions again and again until her own dreams for the day had completely vanished. When had she stopped having opinions? When had she become so focused on pleasing others that she'd forgotten to ask what would please herself? An elderly woman in traditional dress approached her. I'm Margaret, she said. William's sister. He told me about you, the bride at the crossroads. Does everyone know? Sarah asked, embarrassed. This is a small community, but more than that, your story is written all over your face. Margaret smiled kindly. May I tell you something? 53 years ago, I stood exactly where you're standing. I was engaged to a man my family approved of, a man who looked perfect on paper. But my heart belonged to someone else, a man my family thought was too poor, too traditional, too attached to the old ways. What did you do? I chose my heart. I married the man who made me feel alive, who saw me for who I really was. We had 47 beautiful years together before he passed. Not once did I regret that choice, even when it was hard. Margaret paused, looking toward the arena. The question isn't whether you should marry Marcus. The question is whether you're marrying him because you truly love him, or because it's easier than disappointing people. The drums shifted to a new rhythm, and Sarah felt it reverberate through her bones. Without consciously deciding to, she found herself moving toward the arena. The shawl fluttered around her shoulders like wings. That's it, William called out, appearing beside the arena entrance. Don't think. Just feel. Sarah stepped into the circle, her wedding dress a strange ghost of white among the vibrant regalia. She closed her eyes and let the drum rhythm guide her. At first, her movements were tentative, self-conscious. But gradually, something began to unlock inside her. She thought of every time she'd bitten back her opinion, every dream she'd set aside, every moment she'd smiled when she wanted to scream. With each drum beat, she let it go. Her movements became freer, more expansive. She wasn't performing for anyone. She wasn't trying to be perfect. She was simply allowing herself to exist, fully and completely, without apology. Tears streamed down her face, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition, of finally remembering who she'd been before she'd learned to dim her light to make others comfortable. When the song ended, Sarah opened her eyes to find the entire gathering watching her in respectful silence. William approached her in the center of the arena, his weathered face soft with understanding. Now, he said quietly, tell me what you discovered. Sarah's voice shook as she spoke. I discovered that I've been living someone else's life. Not because anyone forced me to, but because I was afraid of disappointing people, afraid of being selfish, afraid of choosing wrong. So I chose nothing. I let others choose for me. And Marcus? William asked gently. Do you love him? The question hung in the air like smoke. Sarah thought about her fiancé, kind, successful, everything her parents had hoped for. She did love him, in a way. But was it the kind of love that could sustain a lifetime? Or was it the comfortable love of habit and expectation? I don't know, she admitted, the words both terrifying and liberating. I think I love the idea of him, the safety he represents. But I'm not sure I know him well enough to love the real him. And I'm absolutely certain he doesn't know the real me. Joseph, who had been watching from the sidelines, joined them in the circle. You want to know something interesting about that accident today? It wasn't chance that you were there. I'd been praying for a sign about my granddaughter. She's about your age, engaged to a man who doesn't value her, planning a wedding she doesn't want. When I saw you pull over in that wedding dress, stopping to help an old man you didn't know, I thought maybe you were my answer. I don't understand, Sarah said. My granddaughter needs to see what you showed us tonight, that it's never too late to choose yourself. That kindness begins with being kind to your own truth. Joseph's eyes glistened. Would you be willing to talk to her? Before Sarah could answer, a young woman emerged from the crowd. She wore jeans and a t-shirt, but her face held the same trapped expression Sarah had seen in her own mirror for months. Grandfather? What's happening? Elena, Joseph said, this is Sarah. She's the bride I told you about, the one who stopped to help me today. Elena looked at Sarah's dust-covered wedding dress with confusion. Aren't you supposed to be getting married tomorrow? I am, Sarah said slowly. Or I was. Or I might be. I honestly don't know anymore. She laughed, a sound that felt strange and wonderful. 24 hours ago, I had my entire life planned out to the minute. Now I'm standing in the middle of a powwow arena in Oklahoma, wearing someone else's shawl, and I've never felt more clear about anything in my life. Clear about what? Elena asked. That I can't marry Marcus. Not tomorrow, maybe not ever. Because I don't know who I am yet, and how can I promise forever to someone when I'm still figuring out who I want to be? Sarah turned to William. Is that what you wanted me to see? William shook his head. I didn't want you to see anything specific. I wanted you to remember how to see it all. You've been sleepwalking through your own life, letting others dream your dreams for you. Tonight, you woke up. Margaret brought Sarah a bottle of water, and as she drank, the older woman said, the bravest thing you can do isn't marrying the right person. It's being the right person, being true to yourself. Everything else follows from that. Sarah looked at Elena, who was watching her with something like hope dawning in her eyes. Are you in the same situation I was? She asked gently. Elena nodded, tears spilling over. Everyone says Diego is perfect for me. His family, my family, all our friends. But when I'm with him, I feel like I'm playing a role in someone else's play. I keep waiting to feel ready, to feel sure, but instead I just feel more and more trapped. Then don't do it, Sarah said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. Don't make the same mistake I almost made. As the night deepened, Sarah sat with Elena beside a small fire, their conversation flowing like water finally released from a dam. They talked about expectations and authenticity, about the difference between disappointing others and betraying yourself. Around them, the fair continued, laughter and music, the smell of fry bread and sage, the timeless rhythm of community. William joined them, lowering himself onto a log bench with the careful movement of age. You know what the two of you are doing right now? You're giving each other the greatest gift one human can give another, permission to be real. Sarah folded the borrowed shawl carefully, preparing to return it. I need to call Marcus. I need to be honest with him, tonight, before tomorrow becomes inevitable. Wait, Elena said suddenly. Can I ask you something? What will you do? After you call off the wedding, where will you go? It was a practical question, one Sarah hadn't fully considered. She had an apartment she shared with Marcus, a job at his father's firm, a life completely intertwined with his. Untangling it would be messy, painful, complicated. I don't know, Sarah admitted. But I'll figure it out. Because anything is better than living a lie. Elena took a deep breath, pulled out her phone, and dialed. Sarah watched as the young woman spoke to her fiancé Diego with trembling but determined voice, explaining that she couldn't marry him, that she needed time to discover who she was outside of everyone's expectations. When Elena hung up, she was crying, but her shoulders looked lighter. He was angry, Elena said, but mostly he was relieved. I think he was as trapped as I was, just too afraid to admit it. Margaret approached with 2 small bundles. For both of you, she said, handing them each a medicine bag. Inside is sage, sweetgrass, and a small stone from the land here. When you're lost in the future, hold this and remember tonight, remember that you had the courage to choose truth over comfort. Sarah called Marcus then, her hands steady even as her heart raced. She was honest, perhaps more honest than she'd ever been. She told him about feeling lost, about not knowing herself, about realizing that she'd been planning a wedding instead of building a partnership. Marcus was hurt, then angry, then finally quiet. I think I knew, he admitted. You've been distant for months. I thought maybe after the wedding, things would get better. But you're right, we can't fix this with a ceremony. The call ended with sadness but without bitterness, and Sarah felt something extraordinary, relief so profound it was almost physical. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, William gathered them all, Sarah, Elena, Joseph, Margaret, and a dozen others who had stayed through the night. What happened here tonight is what we call witnessing. You 2 young women witnessed each other into truth. You stood up and said, I see you, I honor your struggle, and I support your choice to be authentic. He looked directly at Sarah. You came here in a wedding dress, a bride preparing for the wrong ceremony. You leave here wearing something more important, the courage to live an authentic life. That's the real marriage, the one you make with yourself, the commitment to honor your own truth. Sarah hugged Elena, then Joseph, then Margaret. She carefully returned the borrowed shawl, though Margaret insisted she keep the medicine bag. As she walked back to her car in the growing light, still wearing her dusty wedding dress, Sarah felt transformed. Her phone buzzed with messages, panicked texts from her bridesmaids, confused calls from the caterer. There would be disappointment, anger, judgment. There would be difficult conversations and lost deposits and gossip. But there would also be freedom. There would be self-respect. There would be the possibility of real love, built on truth rather than compromise. Sarah drove away from the reservation as the sun rose, her heart full of gratitude for a random accident, an elderly stranger's wisdom, and a community that had shown her what true generosity looked like, giving someone permission to disappoint others in order to honor themselves. Sometimes the greatest love story isn't about finding the right person. It's about finding yourself.